Welcome, welcome. Today we're going to start our first deep dive into the Colle, where each Friday I release a new video where we dig deeper into the Colle and really try to get a handle on it. And for today, for the first one, what I wanted to do was take an example, a couple of diagrams out of this book by George Koltanowski. This variation is actually named after him. It's called the traditional Colle. It's named after Edgar Colle, I guess maybe is the correct way to say it. But he was a blindfold wizard. He had the world blindfold chess record using the Colle system. And he wrote this book on the Colle. And today we're going to be looking at that example with the mainline Colle and how it ties into the endgame. And I think it's going to be really instructive. So my copy, this is actually one of my most prized possessions. It's actually, I got a signed copy from Koltanowski himself. It's from 1984. This was put together. And I just wanted to show, I put it on the screen here, a little quote from Colle that is kind of going to be my motto going forward as I learn the Colle system. And he says in this book, he says, experience has proven that once you know one opening thoroughly in all its strong and weak points, all other openings become much easier to understand and play correctly. Thus, when you once have a good understanding of the Colle with practical experience in playing it, you will be able to switch to any other opening with success. So that's what I wanted to kind of start our embarkation of our journey into the Colle. The Colle, if we learn this well, then we will know an opening really well. And according to George Koltanowski, that will help us learn other openings in the future. And I think that's probably true. I certainly feel like I've learned a lot already just putting this repertoire together. Once again, down in the video description, you can get a full annotated copy of the repertoire and a link to a playlist with all the videos up to this point. So with that being said, let's dig in to these diagrams from Koltanowski. And what we're going to do is we're going to discuss them briefly. And then I'm going to pull up a game that we're going to go through that will kind of highlight how this idea manifests itself in actual games. And we'll learn a little bit about the end game in doing so. And don't worry, in the future, we'll have all kinds of attacking videos and stuff like that. But this kind of underpins in the main line why this Colle system is so effective at club level. If they play kind of optimally against us in a traditional way, we still have a lot of pull. So let's dig into that here. So we're going to look at the main line today. And in the main line, we get this position that could end up in an endgame. So I'm just going to flip through real quickly so you can see which line I'm talking about. And we will cover this in more depth when we go through the example game. But this here is the main line when they do their traditional Queen's Gambit decline kind of setup against us. And the idea is we get this mass liquidation and we get to this position here. And one key thing to note in this position, number one, you'll notice how I pointed out in the introductory videos to the Colle how well this scores. And there's a reason for this. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll get a little bit of an understanding of why this scores so well. But one of the reasons is that if you look at this thing, we have 3 pawns on our queen side versus 2. So we have a queen side pawn majority. And while today with computers and grandmasters, this isn't considered such an advantage at very top level play, this used to be considered one of the many different advantages in chess. Because if you don't have impeccable defensive technique that you've learned, at a top level, basically at our level, this is still a very strong advantage. And so what I wanted to do today was to look at a game and get a feeling for why this is an advantage. And we're going to use these 2 diagrams from this book here that we just read from to kind of highlight this. So let's kind of wipe the pieces off the board here where we just have the pawns and the kings from this position. And we'll just look at that real briefly, and then we'll go to a sample position from George Koltanowski's book. All right, so all we did was we took the pieces off the board. And so here we notice that we have, as we were talking about, a 3-2 advantage on the queen side, and black has a 4-3 advantage on the king side. And so if we were to enter an endgame, you can imagine a scenario where we march these two pawns ahead and eventually turn this pawn, our c pawn, into a passed pawn, and black would create a spearhead with these two pawns and create a passed pawn with their e pawn. And so the key thing to know is that it is an advantage in these king and pawn endgames to have your pawn more towards the outside, because if we get into a situation where we each have a passed pawn, it will take black more time to maneuver over and gobble up our pawn versus us gobbling theirs, assuming that we've centralized these kings, which is a key idea in the endgame, is to centralize those kings. And so Koltanowski, in that book, he shows this position here to kind of highlight how important this idea is and to understand it. And I wanted to look at it real quickly, and then we'll dig into an actual game. And that position that he gives is this position right here. So if we look back at this last example, this is our passed pawn, this is his passed pawn, and he imagines us getting into a scenario where we've each successfully centralized our king and created a passed pawn. And we get into this position right here. And the key is we want to understand why that is an advantage for us, because you can imagine if we're playing a game from this line, we always kind of have this underlying threat of just trading everything off and trying to get into a position such as this. So if we look at this position, our passed pawn is further outside towards the edge of the board than our opponent's passed pawn. And so when our kings are centralized, our king has this passed pawn of our opponent under good control. We're keeping that passed pawn from being pushed. I think it was Nimzovich says you got to keep passed pawns under lock and key, because if we can get this down to the edge of the board, we win, right? And that's what most king and pawn endgames revolve around. So let's say you got into this position, hypothetically, and it's white to move. Try to come up with a plan on how you win this. This is actually a winning position for white. So just go ahead and pause it and come up with a plan. It's white to move and win this position. All right, and how white would win that position is by playing c5, and now we pass the move on to black. So black has to make a move, and as you can see, they don't really have any good moves. They're going to have to stop this pawn from turning into a queen, and so they have to stay within range. And in the example game we'll go through soon, I'll show an easy way to know that, which a lot of people know, but in case you don't, I'll show it to you. But for now, let's just say, okay, well, black needs to back up, right? They have to move. They don't have any pawn moves. And then we just gobble their pawn. And now they are going to have to spend time gobbling up our pawn. But in the meantime, we're just going to go munch their pawns and win the game. So you can imagine something like this. And by the time they come over, there's just no way for them to stop us from advancing our pawn and turning it into a queen. And so in a nutshell, that explains why if we can get everything traded off and we each create a passed pawn, it's normally to our advantage to have that pawn be further towards the outside of the board, right? And that came about basically through our pawn structure. Each of these pawns were able to create a passed pawn. And I know I'm being a little repetitive, but this is a really important concept when you play the Colle, because this is going to be a very common pawn structure that we're going to get, right? So what I want to do now is go into a game, look at an actual example that I found online. Nobody's analyzed this position before. It's just two random players, online blitz, and but it really, I think it kind of really shows how this can manifest itself in an actual game. So, whoops, I'm going to go back to the beginning here. So the player with the white pieces who's playing the Colle is a 2400 online blitz player, and the player with black is a 2300 online blitz player. So these are very strong players, beyond club level, but the play is very interesting because it's going to highlight that importance, of that queenside majority. So let's go through the opening. Remember, we do d4. When they do d5, we do knight to f3. We clamp down on e5. Then we get our bishop ready to go to d3. So this player is following everything from our repertoire. And now c5 is played, putting pressure on our center. And so at this point, white plays c3. And I'll put a link to a video. I actually just today I watched a video by National Master Dane. He's starting to put more content on his YouTube channel. And the video is about moving pawns with the purpose. So here we're moving this pawn with the purpose to support our center. But one thing just to note is that when in doubt, you want to move a piece and not a pawn and keep developing. So if black did not put pressure on our center, we don't need to play c3, right? If they didn't play c5, we don't need to play that c3. Instead, we would just play knight b to d2 and keep developing pawns over pieces. And he did a really good job of explaining this. So I'll put a link to that up above me here and also in the video description. And it's a good one worth checking out. Very instructive. But anyway, we're going to move along. We just get this. We're setting up for our break. I figure I might as well just kind of just talk through these moves as we're playing them. We get to safety first, and then we're going to look towards busting in the center. And in this main line, we precede it with taking and misplacing their bishop, and then we bust in the center. We get this mass liquidation, and we get to the main line. And so we'll watch how this proceeds. Maybe what I'll do is I'll expand. Well, I won't expand this. I'll just say that rook to d8 is the most common move here by far for black. And how white handles this position is very instructive, and we can learn from it. White plays bishop to f4. So the element of time is always important in chess, and it's the same in the Colle system. So we're just getting the pieces developed to active squares first, and then in this position, black plays bishop to b6. Now I think probably black doesn't really necessarily have something prepared, but because they're a strong player, they realize there's this dangerous possibility, because the most common move by far in this position, and one that at club level we will likely see a lot, and it's a mistake, is bishop to d7. And it makes sense, right? Black is thinking, okay, I don't want everything to get liquidated off and get me into this endgame where white has this nagging advantage of this queenside majority. And so they think, okay, we're going to play bishop to d7. It's going to do two things. It's going to prevent the trading off of our rooks, and it's going to protect this knight so that white can't damage black's pawn structure. So you will see this a lot, but I turn the engine on here, and this is actually almost a 3-point advantage for white. So try to look for a move here and see if you can spot why this move here, this move here is just a losing move. So take a second and try to figure that out, because you will see this in your games if you play the Colle system. I guarantee it. And you'll get an easy advantage. Well, the reason is that we have this bishop to c7, right? So we're attacking this, the rook with our bishop. We're attacking the bishop with our rook. It's kind of beautiful, right? So they have to do something. And I guess the best thing for him to do probably is just to go back here, and then we win the exchange. So, and then, we should, with good technique, we'll win that game. So that's a side note. And at some point, I hope to like put a bunch of these ideas together and make a kind of like a tactical video of common Colle tactics like this. But this is one to kind of put in the memory banks because it will happen frequently. So in this game, though, that's not what happened. This player was strong enough to realize that's an issue, so they played this infrequent move, but at least it protects the c7 square. White says, okay, I'm going to take control over this file, move closer to the endgame. That's fine. I've got all my pieces developed. And then now we see White, this 2400 player, plays bishop to d6, and they say, I'm okay trading that off. I'm going to have control of this open file. I'm going to have this 3-2 advantage over here. And hey, I'll trade stuff off. That's fine. So we can remember that too. We don't want to just always trade things for no reason. We want to get our pieces developed first. But we have this kind of thing in this little advantage in the bank here. And now White says, okay, I'm going to damage the pawn structure. I'm not going to just capture this and let his king get centralized. I'm going to capture that and further damage the pawn structure. So we move forward to this position here. White keeps putting pressure on the position. This rook cuts the king from coming over to the left side of the board, right? The king can't get over to the queen side right now. And if you notice, look at the activity of our pieces. This is a much better position for us, right? We have our rook developed on the open file. We have our knight centralized, so it covers all these squares because it's centralized, right? And compare that, sorry, that's a bad arrow, but compare that to this bishop on its first rank, hasn't developed. The rook still on its starting square. So we know this is better for us, and White realizes this and is just going to continue to put pressure on the position. Jumps in with check, forcing Black to make a decision where he's going to go. Like the interesting thing is he can't go back to the first rank, so there's no decision to be made actually. So that was kind of, I misspoke there, but if he comes back to the first rank, bam, we have an Arabian mate. Kind of an interesting one. So Black is forced to come back over to f6, and then we make use of the fact that Black is behind in development, and this is just a very, very difficult position for Black, right? Especially in blitz, but just it's probably going to be lost in a long time control game as well. So Black is trying to make space here, but it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. White shuts down any further pawn pushes. Black doesn't have much to do, so they just start pushing their kingside pawns. Notice how White just plays patiently. They're going to get their king centralized. Centralizing their king. And now, in this moment here, Black just was kind of just, the pressure got too much and they flinched and they made this move. And what we're going to do in a second here is we're going to take all the pieces off the board so that we can understand this queenside pawn majority advantage. But first, we'll just quickly look at how White finished Black off here. This is, just overwhelming, so it's worth looking at. But we can see, look, won a pawn now, getting that queenside pawn majority rolling. Throw a little salt in the wound here. We can see that this is not going well. And at this point, Black resigns. White is just going to shove that pawn up the board, right? So, but let's see if we can get a little bit of an instructive moment here when black plays bishop to b7. This was a move that just tactically loses because it drops this pawn and we get this overwhelming position going. But let's just try to get a little better understanding of this nagging pressure in the position of having this queenside pawn majority. So let us just take all the pieces off the board in this position. We saw that white was able to win this in a dynamic way. But to learn more about why we had this inherent advantage, we just took the pieces off the board there. And let's pretend that we are white. How do we win this game? Try to just come up with a winning plan for white based on kind of the stuff we've looked at so far in this video. If you want to pause it, go ahead. But interestingly, we can actually just play b4, right? We're going to use this pawn majority on the queen side to create a passed pawn. And that's going to give us a winning position. And so, well, the first thing we would look at in this position from here to really get a good understanding of the position, and then we can kind of look at digging into the weeds a little bit if we want. But the crux of this position is well, if black starts capturing, let's look at how that plays out. We capture back, they capture, and we get to this position right here. And this is the key to the position. So if you're aware of the square of the pawn, basically what the square of the pawn is when you have a passed pawn or your opponent has a passed pawn, there's a very fast and easy way to tell whether or not you can promote that pawn, whether the opposing king can catch that pawn. And I apologize for people who know this. I just figure it's worth pointing out because it's super helpful for those who don't know this kind of trick. And the idea is if you draw a box where you take the diagonal of the pawn to the edge of the board and then you draw a box, if the black king can get inside that box at any point in time and there's no obstructions anywhere for them, then they can catch that pawn. But if they can't get inside the square of that pawn, then they cannot catch it. So let's look at the square of the pawn for black. Well, the square is like this. And you can Google that and find all kinds of videos. I'm sure people have put videos on this. But we are already inside the square of the pawn. And so the idea is if black were to push the pawn, then the square would become like this. And we could still step inside that box, which means we can catch that pawn. So that is the key to understanding this position, is that in this position right here, if we just say did some random move, we'll still win it, but for the sake of, let's just pretend that these were the only things on the board. There's no other pieces on the board. We will just push this pawn and move the square of that pawn so that black cannot catch that pawn. And we just keep shrinking the square of that pawn. And we'll see black cannot get in that square, and we will just win. And then if at any point, instead of chasing that pawn, if black says, well, we'll push our pawn, which they may do, and they may hope, okay, well, maybe if white doesn't step inside the square of that pawn, and we push, they hope that maybe they'll get a situation like this, where we queen at the same time. But we don't, the key is that we don't have to let that happen. Once they move their pawn forward and decrease the size of the square, we can just step inside the square, right? We don't have to move that because they are not in the square of our pawn. And if they try to come over now, we can just keep pushing. So we kind of see like the essence of why this queenside pawn majority is so important. And you could also imagine a scenario where we get this pawn and they get that pawn, but we're closer, and then we can go over and gobble all their kingside pawns. That was kind of like our example earlier, this position here, where we make them waste time catching our pawn and we gobble their pawns. So that is basically the key to understanding where our inherent advantage comes uh, in the main line in the Colle system. And while a computer or a grandmaster or an international master would likely hold that position, our opponents won't. They'll make mistakes along the way. So let's just zoom back to the beginning of this. We said that this is one way to win it. And the first thing we would look at, of course, is all of these captures and realize that this puts black outside the square of that pawn, right? So you can see how much calculation we can save. So we know that that doesn't work for black. And then, well, if they don't take it, well, what do they do? If they don't take it with one of the pawns, what do they do? If they take it with this pawn, well, we end up in this same basic scenario, right? So that doesn't really change anything. So then, I guess what else did they do really? Did they try to centralize their king? Well, then we get into kind of our first kind of example, where as if black says, okay, well, I'm going to, instead of making these exchanges, I'm going to try to get my king inside the square of this pawn. So they kind of go like this. Well, at that point, a number of things work, but we can fall on our original plan when we say, okay, well, you're going to have to waste time getting this pawn. And in the meantime, we're going to gobble these pawns because they have to take, if they want to get at it, they have to take this kind of roundabout way. And then we can go over and gobble all their pawns up, right? So we won't, you can play around with it if you want, but the key, I think we kind of, beat the key idea to death, but I think it's important to do that to try to understand the essence of that advantage of the queenside pawn majority. And our opponents likely aren't going to play grandmaster level defense against us, and I think that's why this main line scores so much better. White wins at a 2-to-1 clip versus black because it is in fact such a difficult position for black to play if they don't have experience in it. And most people don't have much experience playing against the Colle. And that's why I think it's such a beautiful system to play for us club players and to learn from. So, yeah, there you have it. I'll be making a video that I'll drop every Friday as we do more of a deep dive into the Colle. And like I said, I really like koltanowski's vision here, where if we can get really good at one opening, then it gives us confidence. We see the process of learning an opening, and then we will, in the future we can be in a better position to learn other openings and fully understand them. So we'll see everybody next Friday. Have a good one.